Thank you everybody for taking time on your afternoon. Some of you are sitting at your computers. Some of you, if you want to take me for a walk so you can get some exercise while listening to me, that's totally okay. I'm not going to use a ton of slides. You'll be able to follow along even if you aren't looking at the screen. I'll talk for 20-25 minutes. I'll talk about how I got motivated and inspired to write this book. I'll talk a little bit about the theoretical, substantive, and methodological contributions that I hope this book is making. I know not everybody in the audience is an academic, so if there are parts that totally confuse you, that's okay. It'll probably end quickly and I'll move on to something that you do get, so don't zone out. I love questions. I'm really excited for that part. And then I'll share with you just like some fun emails that I've been getting as my research has been out in the world and how people are responding to it. I will say I'm getting a lot less hate mail than I expected. But I'll share some of the hate mail that I have gotten. Okay, great. So give me a second here. I will share this first slide just so you could see what the cover of my book looks like. If you ever see it at an airport, which is really my dream, just let me know. I know that's a high bar these days. Nobody really reads books, but you know, maybe in some really religious states you'll see it. Okay, so how did I come to write this book is usually the first question that I get. So I was a doctoral student at Stanford University in the Graduate School of Education. I was doing a program in sociology of education and Jewish studies. And I came into graduate school really with the intention of focusing on American Jews. And so in my first couple of years, I was taking a lot of sociology classes and I had a background in education. And I was thinking a lot about inequality. And as you might imagine, I was spending a lot of time thinking about the role of race and class and gender. And in 2015, the Pew Research Center came out with its 2014 Religious Landscape Study. So for those of you who have seen the study, right, it was this very, very large, nationally representative study about religious attitudes, beliefs, behaviors across the United States. And one of the leading headlines when the study came out was that there was a religious decline in America. And so I opened up this study, and actually what stuck out to me was not that there was a religious decline in America, which was true, but actually what stuck out to me was how religious America still was. I actually did not realize it. And I've spent a lot of time over the past couple of years thinking about like, why didn't I realize it? So it helps to know just a little bit about sort of my background and why I was perplexed by the religious intensity of America. So I grew up in Russia. I'm from Russia. Before you judge, let me explain. I grew up as a Russian Jew, and so under communism, Jews were persecuted. My family were political refugees. We were called refuseniks, and we tried for many, many years to get out. It was very difficult for my parents. We finally got permission to leave in 1988. We immigrated to Philadelphia. I have no Russian ties and no affinity towards Russia. And so for anyone out there wondering, like, Russian Jews are very distinct from Russian non-Jews. So just know that. So I came to Philadelphia. I didn't even know what being Jewish was. And I actually don't even need to be screen sharing right now. My parents came to America. They wanted more economic opportunity. They also wanted to teach, to have me and my sister learn about what it meant to be Jewish. They didn't really know anything, but you know, it said Jewish on our passport. They knew it was an important part of our tradition, our history, and they wanted us to be able to learn about it. And so I spent most of my adolescence and formative years once we moved in Jewish educational settings. So I went to Jewish private schools, Jewish summer camps. I was in a Jewish youth group, and I I was in a very pluralistic environment, which meant that I was hanging out with Jews from across the spectrum of sort of religious observance. In my school in Philadelphia, there were Reform Jews, conservative Jews, Orthodox Jews. And so while my family was not really practicing, and I got a taste of what more observant people sort of looked like, and I got to appreciate what religion looks like, at least for Jews. And then I went to college, and I went to Emory. And when I came to Emory, I was so woefully unprepared, actually, I realized later, to talk about religion, because I had actually only ever met Jews. I actually came to Emory having never met somebody who wasn't Jewish. I know that sounds crazy, right? Jews hurt 2% of the United States population, but here I was, I got to Emory. I didn't understand the difference between Protestants and Catholics. I didn't know the kinds of questions to ask. And my friends and I didn't really talk about religion. Like the Jewish kids, would talk about, oh, you went to the summer camp? I went to that summer camp. You know that person? I know that person. But beyond that, I did not talk about religion. And I left college very unprepared to talk about religion. And I left college not even understanding that religion was a really important part of American history and the way that Americans still organize their lives today. So fast forward, I'm now, in my late 20s, early 30s, I'm at Stanford, and I am very surprised that still a good quarter of Americans are organizing their lives around religion. And I said to myself, if I want to study American Jews, I think I should probably take a step back and try to understand religion in America more broadly. And so and the thing that I was particularly curious about as a sociologist of education is that if it is the case, or that we spend so much time thinking about the role of class and race and gender and how those social factors shape kids in the classroom, and I wondered, well, is it possible that their religious upbringing is also influencing them in some ways in the classroom? And so I went to my advisor and I said, Ari, I know you brought me here to study American Jews, but how do you feel about me, writing a dissertation about conservative Christians? I think it'll make me a better scholar of American Jews. And he was totally okay with that. And so that is how this project originated. Some of you might be wondering if I got any pushback. Somebody said to me recently, they're like, we don't usually see these kinds of dissertations coming out of Stanford. And it's true. I did get some pushback. I got some weird, or not weird, but surprising, I guess, remarks from some faculty, some who said, well, religion is just a proxy for class, or you're barking up the wrong tree, or why don't you do that after you get tenure? And then I had a really wonderful advisor, Eric Bettinger, who is LDS. He's an economist of education at Stanford. And he said, look, he's like, just make sure you diversify the risk portfolio of your research, right? Have some projects that are high risk and potentially high reward, and some projects that are low risk and low reward. And so I said, okay, this was going to be my high risk, potentially high reward project. And so here we are 7 years later, and I am glad I made that investment. So let me talk about how I went about doing this project and doing the study, because I think understanding the methodological, my methodology is important to understand the kinds of claims that I make in the book. So I realized right as a grad student, I wasn't going to be able to collect nationally representative longitudinal data myself, which is what I really wanted. But fortunately, I found out that a team of people at Notre Dame had already done this work on my behalf. And so in 2003, Chris Smith, a sociologist at Notre Dame, had launched the National Study of Youth and Religion, the NSYR. And this study followed over 3,200, so 3,290 teenagers. The teenagers were 13 to 17 at the time of the study. And they followed them for 10 years, right? So every couple of years, they would survey them. The first 3 rounds of surveys were done by phone, and the last survey was done web-based. And they also interviewed about 220 of them repeatedly over this 10-year period. And these interviews lasted for, several hours. The quantitative sample, the survey sample, is nationally representative. And what I did is, for those of you in the audience who do longitudinal research, know that there's a really big problem with attrition, right? It's really hard to follow people, especially if you're interested in educational outcomes or any sort of like labor market outcomes, because people fall out of the survey, and the kinds of people who fall out of the survey tend to be lower income, lower socioeconomic status. And so I really needed to overcome that limitation to be able to make any claims about educational outcomes. And so what I did was I linked the National Study of Youth and Religion to the National Student Clearinghouse. The National Student Clearinghouse, for probably all of you out in the audience, all of you are recorded in their database. It houses the higher education records on a semester by semester or quarter by quarter basis for, I think, over 95% of students entering US higher education institutions. And so if you give them, so in my case, I worked with the NSYR team, they gave them the name, the birthday, and some other information about each of the original NSYR respondents, and then they send back a file, and it gives me every semester that they've spent at any university, if they got any sort of degree, what major they had, and so on and so forth. And I did this match in 2016. The NSYR had ended in 2013. And the reason that's important is because it gave, by the time I did the data match, the NSYR respondents were already in their late 20s. And the research shows that if you're going to complete a bachelor's degree, you would have most likely have done it by the time you're 30. And so waiting these extra couple of years to do the match gave me more certainty about the validity of these data. So what did I find? If you were going to take away like one sentence of my findings, is that an intensely religious upbringing, and I'll explain what that means. Basically, kids who grow up in intensely religious homes go on to complete more years of education, but often at less selective colleges. Okay, so they overperform in educational attainment and they undermatch in the college selection process. So that's the general story, but there's a lot of variation. And one of the most interesting things I think about the book is how the story varies by kids based on their socioeconomic status and also based on gender. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So let me first talk about why it is that kids go on to, kids who grow up intensely religious go on to complete more years of education. So first of all, what do I mean by intensely religious? I looked first at the survey data, and I used the survey. I did like a latent class analysis and did a variety of things. But basically, the kids who look intensely religious in their surveys are the kinds of kids who say, I pray on a regular basis. I go to religious services, more than once a week. God plays a central role in my life. My faith is really important in my day-to-day decision-making. And these questions, you should know, it's a very sort of Protestant and Christian-centric notion of religion. And so the kinds of kids who look religious, are those kids. And so of the 3,200 NSYR participants, a quarter of them fell into this intensely religious bucket, a group that I call abiders. And of those quarter, right, of those 25%, half are conservative Protestant, 12% are mainline Protestant, 14% are Catholic, 15% are Black Protestant, and the remaining 6% are LDS. So if you're wondering, is this just a story about evangelicals? No, it's not just a story about evangelicals, although evangelicals certainly feature prominently as they represent about half of these intensely religious kids. So I then went into the interview data and I said, well, maybe these kids just look religious on surveys, but do they really sound really religious in their interviews? And remarkably, the answer was yes. I found a lot of consistency between their interview data and their survey data, because I was really worried about things like social desirability, over-reporting, right? We know people over-report their religious attendance. But when I read the interviews with these adolescents, it's hard to fake your religious commitments for 2 hours when somebody is, peppering you with questions. And I had a very large team of research assistants reading the data alongside me, because I was very worried about issues of positionality and my own sort of, lack of knowledge about Christianity, but also any potential sort of misunderstandings I might have in reading the data. So I had a large team of RAs, and we found that overall, kids were very consistent in their surveys and their interviews. And so these intensely religious kids are the kinds of kids who grow up in families that are also very religious. There's a strong correlation between the family's religious commitments and the kids. And what I talk about in my book, and the theoretical argument that I make in my book, is this. I start with the fact that, we know, right, that that kids' socioeconomic status, their social class background, influences academic outcomes. And we know this from the work of sociologists like Annette Lareau and Jessica Calarco. For those of you who know Annette Lareau, she, in the late 80s, early 90s, did some really seminal work that showed that parents from different social class backgrounds have very different child rearing logics. And those child rearing logics matter for kids, because what those kids learn from their parents doesn't just end when they leave home, right? And it doesn't just stop at the public school door. Those class dispositions that they learn, like advocating. Hi. You guys, somebody's not muted. Oh, thank you, Kathy. The kinds of class-based dispositions that that kids learn from their parents, right, transfer into the school domain. And I had a very similar question, would the religious dispositions that children learn in their homes also translate into some sort of advantage or maybe disadvantage into the school domain, right? We know separation of, there's a separation of church and state, but I wondered if sort of those religious dispositions could cross over into the school domain. And in reading and rereading the work of Annette Lareau, which I've long admired, I realized that her two class-based child rearing strategies don't account for the role of religion in people's lives. And if any of you have read it and you go back, you'll hear she talks about this one boy, I think his name was Tyrek, and his family actually is very involved in their church and talk about God, but that doesn't come up in Annette Lareau's analysis of class. And so I basically in the book introduce I say Annette Lareau missed this third child rearing style. And this child rearing style I call religious restraint. And I argue that it cuts across social class lines and across gender lines and across racial lines as well. I see it evident amongst all the kids in the sample, regardless of their class, gender, race, or even their religious denomination sometimes. And I argue that this child rearing of religious restraint, that kids who grow up in these homes where there is this really, really strong emphasis on orderliness, on following the rules, on spending time with family, on harmonious relationships, that the kinds of kids who grow up in these religiously restrained homes develop a disposition of conscientiousness and cooperation, right? They're very good rule followers. They're happy to listen to authority because they have been practicing this from very, very early on in life. They do it in their home, they do it in their church, and they do it in other aspects of their life. Here is something important. There's a reason why this matters in the school domain, because conscientiousness and cooperation wouldn't necessarily translate to any sort of benefit in, let's say, on the soccer field, or maybe an art class or drama class. But there's something about our public schools that makes religion sticky. And I talk in the book about the Protestant-based roots of our public schools, right? For those of you who don't know, our public schools actually began as places that would teach people to be literate so that they could read the Bible and communicate with God. And a lot of the sort of forms of the original public school, which was then called the common school, are still with us today. This is why we see the sort of model where teachers, right, are at the front of the room and they view the kids as these like vessels of information. And if you think about it, right, the sort of structure of schools doesn't look all that different than the structure of churches, right? Someone's in front of you, sort of lecturing at you, and you're just kind of sitting there and having to listen and abide by the rules. And so the kinds, I'll get to causal claims in a second, or in a few minutes. Thank you so much. So the kinds of kids that have practiced these dispositions of conscientiousness and cooperation have an academic advantage, because when they show up in kindergarten, they've already learned what education scholars and sociologists call the hidden curriculum of school, right? The rules, the routines, the regulations. So much of, if you have any kids in kindergarten or watch what kids learn in kindergarten, this is what they spend a lot of their time doing, is learning the rules, routines, and regulations. And these intensely religious kids they know how to do that. And so this benefits them because teachers reward them for this. One of the things I ask, try to get readers to think about is, we think of our schools as maybe rewarding creativity or critical thinking, but really what they're rewarding is rule following and a sort of compliant behavior. But it works in some capacity because it does translate into higher grades than their less religious peers. And as a result of getting good grades, right, grades are the strongest predictor of your ability to get into college and your ability to succeed and graduate from college. And so these abiders benefit from this early advantage, and they go on to complete more years of college education. The class story is, I'll just sum it up really quickly. The kids who benefit the most, I'll just share this one slide. So this is the percentage of abiders versus non-abiders from the 4 different class groups that I break people up into, and their probability of getting a bachelor's degree. And so you can see here basically that this working class group and this middle class group, the abider advantage is the strongest. So in the case of working class kids, for those of you that aren't looking at the slides, 32% of abiders go on to complete a BA compared to 16% of non-abiders. So they're twice as likely. But you don't see this advantage in the professional class, and you don't see such a big advantage in amongst the poor. And so why is that? So amongst the professional class, I argue that the kinds of advantages that religious kids have, they're able to basically have from their class sort of position, right? They sort of don't need religion to get a leg up because they already have a lot of other advantages. So religion doesn't do much to sort of get them up any higher. And for these poor kids, religion isn't enough to help them overcome all of the profound obstacles to get to college. Because remember, the road to college varies greatly for people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, right? If you are a kid in the professional class or the sort of even the upper end of the middle class, your road to college is a smooth, flat road with not a lot of detours. And if you happen to get off the exit by, getting kicked out of school, it's pretty easy to get back onto the ramp to college. However, if you are a working class kid, and certainly if you are poor, your road to college is so steep and so bumpy and so potholy, and there are so many opportunities to fall off and very few opportunities to get back on. So the kinds of things that religion does for kids, basically the kids who are poor, it's like not enough to help them overcome all of those, that steep potholy hill. I want to get to this question. Let me just say about undermatching, and then I want to talk about causality and then open it up. So my book is called like the Religion's Surprising Impact on Academic Success. One of the reasons is this thing that happens where, right, kids overperform in educational attainment, but they undermatch in the college selection process. So what I mean there is that we have long known that kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they go to less selective colleges, like kids who are valedictorians, for example. There's a good book called Top Student, Top School, right? It shows that valedictorians who grow up lower income, undermatch in the college selection process. They're not able to, they don't know about the selective colleges. They're not able to go to the selective colleges because they lead more interdependent lives. And we've thought, scholars have thought that this undermatching process happens along class lines. My book shows that it also happens along religious lines, because the kids in this professional class, in the sort of top quarter of the socioeconomic distribution, go on to less selective colleges than they could probably get into based on their stellar performance in middle and high school. And the reason they do this has to do with self-concept. And so as I read the interviews of kids starting from the time they're adolescents and followed them throughout 20s, it was very clear that intensely religious kids develop a self-concept, a sense of themselves that is very much rooted in notions of parenthood, altruism, and service to God. It is not rooted in ideas of prestigious careers. And so for them, there's it's like, I'm going to go to college because I'm sort of middle upper class and this is what people do, but I don't really care where I go to college. I don't care how selective it is. They often apply to one school. It's often the school that is closest to their home. There are also kids who are not particularly open to new experiences. So they yearn for social homogeneity. They're not the kinds of kids who are like, I can't wait to get to college and meet new people and learn from them and sort of explore the world around me. They are kids who are very comfortable with the way their lives are. They're worried about having their religious ideas questioned. They have heard that that sometimes happens on religious or on college campuses. And so they prefer to stay close to home. Sometimes they actually live at home, and they don't have any particularly strong goals around prestigious careers or going to graduate school. And so they don't really see a reason why they should like uproot their lives and stability to go far away to college. Okay, so that's the short version story about how, or medium-ish story about how this religious upbringing leads to an overperformance in educational attainment and an underperformance, you could say, or undermatching in the college selection process. During the Q&A, someone should ask me about atheists. I'm happy to talk about them. They do very well for very different reasons. But I want to talk about this issue of causality. One of the first things that one of my colleagues were asking me when I was presenting very initial data analyses showing that there was a positive relationship between religious, these intensely religious kids and their grades. And so one of my colleagues at Stanford, Ben Doming, who's a psychometrician, he said, I bet what you're really observing is a spurious relationship. Okay, so a little bit of stat speak. You can tune out for a minute, but just like join back in if this gets over your head. This is a spurious relationship where basically there's some unobserved family level or neighborhood level factors that can't be captured in the surveys. And that because of those sort of unobserved factors, that they are confounding your relationship. So what you're seeing is like a family level effect and you just can't observe it. And so I said, that's a really good point. Maybe this is just really a story about, religious kids grow up in the kinds of families who are maybe sitting with their kids and doing more schoolwork and are more involved in the PTA and that everything is explained for by family level factors. So here's what we did. We could not use the NSYR to answer this question, but we could use something else. The National Study for Adolescent to Adult Health, which is usually known as AdHealth, this is a study that has followed 20,000 teenagers since the mid-90s, collected data over the years on siblings within the same families. And sibling level data are really wonderful opportunities to explore the role of families and neighborhoods, because you can assume that most things that happen for siblings in the same household are shared. And so if you're able to sort of net out or control for things that are happening at the family level, you might be able to see if that's really a confounding factor or not. So we did this analysis. It's published in Social Science Research. And my colleague Ben said, I bet all the effect of religiosity is going to go away. And I said, cool, let's see. And it didn't. It did not go away. Here, I will share one slide just for people who are interested in these effect sizes and here you go. So basically, briefly speaking, we ran the data, and basically the way we're able to do this is because siblings within the same families don't always look the same on their religiosity. And so we're specifically interested in these siblings who have different sort of different levels of religiosity. And what we find at like sort of a layman's level is that kids, even within the same families, the more religious sibling will still go on to get better grades and complete more years of college than their less religious sibling. Why does this matter for claims of causality? My co-authors and I, Ben Domingue and Kathleen Harris, made the argument in this article that this was the first sort of causal level or potentially causal level evidence, or evidence that allowed us to make causal claims to suggest that religion may in fact have some sort of causal relationship or causal effect on academic outcomes. So I think without the study, I'm not sure I would have written the book because I think this provided a different level of evidence that the NSYR data couldn't have provided. So if you're wondering, like, is this just a story about family and neighborhood level factors? The answer is no, it's not just that.